Do you remember what it was to wait weeks for the sun, and then have it break through all at once over a wet green town, and every soul stop and look up? Up there, where an hour before there'd been nothing but gray, a mountain would appear, 14,000 feet of white over the rooftops, and the whole city would say the same three words: "The mountain is out." And do you remember when the future had an address, and the address was here? A slender tower climbing into that gray sky. A train out of tomorrow gliding through the middle of town. A whole world's fair telling one little rainy port on the edge of the map that it was about to become something new. Down on the water, the ferries blew their horns across the sound, and up on the hill, the salmon went flying over the counters at the old market. I'm Henry. Welcome to sweet old America. Today we're going back to Seattle, Washington, in the spring of the 1960s. Back when it was still a small town, really, fishermen and mill hands and Boeing men tucked in the far green corner of the country, where it rained, and then the whole world turned to blossom. And for one shining spring, that rainy little town lifted its head and reached out toward the future, and believed with its whole heart that it had hold of it. Nobody at that fair, under all those lights, had the least idea what was coming. So pour yourself something warm, pull your chair up to the window, and let the rain come down. If this green, rainy town is yours too, stay with us, subscribe, and we'll walk the whole country back together. Let's go find Seattle while the future is still ahead of it. So let's begin the way a Seattle day so often began, in the rain. Not a hard rain, mind you. Seattle never went in much for the hard, dramatic kind. This was the other kind, the kind that town was famous for. A soft, fine, patient gray drizzle that hung in the air more than it fell, that beaded up on your wool coat and misted your face, and went on, quietly, for days. You'd wake to it, and the whole world would be the color of a dove's wing. The sky, the water, the streets, all one soft gray. And the smell of it would come in the window, that clean, green, wet smell of a rain-soaked evergreen town. Cedar and salt and coffee and wet pavement. And you'd pull on your coat, and you'd not even bother with an umbrella, because a real Seattleite scorned an umbrella the way a fish scorns a raincoat. And you'd head out into the soft gray morning. And there was one place above all others to head, down the hill toward the water, and that was the market. Pike Place Market. If Seattle had a heart, and it did, you could stand right in the middle of it, on those worn wooden floors, with the rain drumming soft on the roof, and the whole roaring, shouting, fragrant life of the city going on all around you. The market had been there a long time, since 1907, when a handful of farmers, sick to death of the middlemen who bought their produce cheap and sold it dear, had backed their wagons up to the edge of Pike Place and started selling straight to the people, cutting out the middleman, farmer to customer, honest and direct. Just 8 of them that first day, and the people had come and come and come, and it had grown into this, a great rambling warren of stalls and stairs and buildings tumbling down the hillside toward the bay. The most alive place in the whole city, and the most loved. Come in out of the rain then, and let it take you in. The first thing was the sound, the shouting of the vendors, the calling of the prices, the buskers with a guitar or a fiddle set up under the great neon clock that read Public Market, all of it echoing under the low roof. Then the color, which after all that gray outside hit you like a brass band. The high stalls piled with fruit and vegetables stacked into glistening pyramids, the apples and the pears from the valleys, the first tender greens of spring, and the flowers, oh, the flowers, whole banks of them, the daffodils and the tulips coming up from the fields to the north, buckets and buckets of them, more color in one stall than the whole gray sky had shown you all week. And then the smell, the produce, the flowers, the coffee, the fish, the wet wood, the rain, the salt off the bay below, all of it braided together into the one smell that meant the market, that meant Seattle, that meant home. And the market was deeper than it looked. It went down. Below those main stalls, staircase after staircase, tumbled a whole warren of little shops down the hillside, level below level, and a child could get gloriously lost in them for a whole afternoon. There was the shop that sold nothing but magic tricks, and the one full of old comic books, and the one with the curiosities and the junk and the treasures all jumbled together. The little import groceries fragrant with spices from the far side of the world, the cheese man, the honey man, the fellow who ground his own coffee in the window so the good brown smell of it rolled out the door. Every turn of those low, crooked passages showed you something you'd never laid eyes on before. It was the least modern place imaginable, all wet wood and hand-lettered signs, and old men who'd kept the same stall for 40 years. And it was, right there in the shadow of a city trying so hard to be modern, the most beloved corner of the whole town. And up in the high stalls, the farmers stood behind their produce in the gray morning, the way they had since the very start. The truck farmers up from the valleys, the Italian and Japanese and Filipino families who had worked that black bottom land for generations, bringing in the lettuces and the berries and the first asparagus of the spring. The apples they'd kept all winter, the eggs, the honey, the cut flowers. You could talk to the very person who'd grown the thing you were buying, ask how the season was coming, hear him grumble about the rain, and hand your coins straight into the hand that had pulled it out of the ground that morning. There is a whole world of trust in that we have mostly lost now, knowing the face and the field behind your food. At the market, in those years, it was simply how a body shopped. But the thing you really came to see, the thing every child begged to go watch, was the fish. Down in the fish stalls, the mongers stood in their rubber boots and their long rubber aprons behind a great sloping bed of crushed ice, and on that ice lay the wealth of the whole cold Pacific. The salmon, silver and pink, the king and the sockeye and the coho, the Dungeness crab and the oysters and the clams and the halibut in great white slabs. And when a customer up and bought a big salmon, why, the man behind the counter would take that whole fish and holler out and haul back and throw it the entire length of the stall, a 5-pound salmon flying through the air over the heads of the crowd, and another monger down the way would catch it, smack, in 2 bare hands, and the whole crowd would cheer. They'd been doing that as long as anyone could remember, tossing the fish, half for the work of it and half for the pure show. And some of those fish stalls, and some of the produce stalls too, had been run by the same families for generations. Families who'd come from all over the world to fetch up here at the edge of America, some of them from as far off as Turkey and the far Greek island of Rhodes, keeping a stall at the market their grandfathers had kept, in the new country, in the rain. And the market had its music and its characters too, the way it always has. Down under the big neon clock and along the arcades out of the wet, the buskers set up, a fellow with a guitar, an old man with a fiddle, a kid with a banjo and an open case for your coins. And their playing echoed up and down those wooden halls all day long. And the place bred characters the way it bred cats. The vendor who'd been there since before the war and knew every regular by name and by usual order. The flower ladies, the fishmongers with their patter and their flying salmon. The odd, hopeful drifters, and the old-timers who came just to sit and watch the whole show roll by. It was a town square, really, the last true one the city had. A place where everybody, rich and poor and strange and ordinary, brushed shoulders in the same wet crowd, and belonged there equally, and somehow knew it. And a body could eat there too, cheap and good, at the little counters tucked in among the stalls. A stool at a worn counter, a bowl of soup, a wedge of pie, a sandwich thick as your fist, made by somebody's own hands, right there in front of you, while the rain drummed on the roof overhead. You'd sit steaming in your wet coat with a cup of coffee and watch the whole parade of the market roll by out the window. The shoppers, the vendors, the characters, the fish going through the air, and feel about as content and as at home as a person can feel in a public place. That was the real gift of the market. It was never just a store. It was a living room for the whole city, and every last soul was welcome in it. Now I have to tell you something, standing here in the middle of all this life, and it's hard to believe now, but it's true. In the 60s, they very nearly tore the whole thing down. That's a fact. The market had gotten old, and the buildings sagged, and it had never quite recovered from the war, for the war had done a cruel thing to it, sending away into the camps the Japanese families who had farmed so much of that produce and run so many of those stalls, and a great many of them never came back. And so the market limped, and the downtown around it was hungry for the land. And the developers looked at all those acres of sagging old wood on that priceless hill above the bay, and they saw office towers, parking, progress. They drew up the plans to level it, to knock down the most beloved place in the whole city and put up something clean and modern and profitable. And it took a fight, a real fight. A scrappy, grassroots citizens' uprising, led by an architect who loved the place, folks who called themselves the Friends of the Market, to save it. To stand in front of the wrecking ball and say no, this one we keep. And they won, thank God, and it stands to this day. But it was a near thing, and it ought to remind us of something we'll come back to more than once before we're done, that the things we love the most are never quite as safe as they look, and that sometimes it takes a few stubborn souls willing to stand up and fight for the old and the beautiful, or it's a parking lot and gone. So let's be glad it stands, and buy a paper cone of hot roasted nuts to warm our hands, and climb up out of the market and up the hill into downtown, into the shopping heart of the city, where the rain had eased to a mist and the streetlights still glowed against the gray. Because Seattle had a proper downtown in those years, a real one, and going downtown was an event. The women put on their good coats and their gloves and their hats for it. And the great cathedral of it, the grandest store in the whole Northwest, was Frederick and Nelson. Frederick's, a tall and dignified old department store that took up a whole city block, with the doormen and the elevator operators and the tea room, and floor after floor of everything a body could want, laid out beautiful. And up on the 10th floor of that store, they made something with their own hands that the whole city loved. A little chocolate. A chocolate mint truffle, dark and rich and cool, that they called the Frango. The Frango mint. You'd buy a box of them wrapped up nice for your mother or for a sweetheart, or just a quarter-pound in a little sack to eat one at a time walking in the rain. And to this day there are grown men and women scattered across this country who cannot taste a chocolate mint without being carried straight back to that store and that city and their mother's gloved hand. And a store like that was far more than a store. It was an occasion. You rode the elevator with the operator in her uniform calling out the floors, and you had your lunch up in the tea room, chicken a la king and a parfait, the ladies in their hats at the little tables. The doormen knew the regulars by sight. The window displays out on the sidewalk were done up like little theaters, and folks would walk down of an evening just to see them, pressing their noses to the glass. Going downtown to the big stores was a whole day's outing that a family dressed for and looked forward to. And a child taken along felt the great hushed grandness of it, the marble, the perfume, the gleaming counters, the certain sense that you had entered somewhere that mattered. It was shopping, yes, but it was also theater and ceremony and a treat, in a way that a bright fluorescent aisle out at a mall would never once manage to be. And a few blocks over stood Frederick's great friendly rival, the Bon Marché. The Bon, everybody called it, which was the store for everybody, the working man's store, with the better bargains and the friendlier prices, where a family did its real shopping. And the Bon had figured out something that the grand old Fredericks was slower to see, that there was a brand new creature loose in the land in the 60s, and it was called the teenager. And it had its own money, and its own music, and its own ideas about clothes. So the Bon opened up special little shops inside the big store, just for the young people. One of them called the Tiger Shop, full of the mod new fashions, the bright, bold styles the kids saw on the television and heard about in the songs. And the teenagers of the whole Puget Sound country came flocking to it. The old world and the new, right there under one department store roof. The mother buying her Frangos on one floor, and up on another her daughter buying something her mother would frown at, and both of them happy as could be. And the rain, you know, made the people as much as it made the town. A place that gray and that wet turns you a certain way. It kept you indoors a good deal, and so it made a bookish, thoughtful, private sort of people, quick to a quiet hobby and slow to a loud hello. Folks who'd nod to a neighbor for 20 years and never once intrude. It made them hardy and unbothered and faintly proud of their own weather. A true Seattleite carried no umbrella and owned a good pair of galoshes and never once complained about the drizzle. Because complaining about the rain in Seattle was like complaining that the sea was wet. And it gave the whole town a soft, gray, patient, unhurried quality, a kind of modesty that the sharp, bright cities elsewhere never had. They were water people and rain people and evergreen people up there in the far corner, keeping to themselves and mostly liking it that way. And then, a few times a year, the sun would come and remind them all over again exactly why they stayed. For the town was made of water as much as of land. It sat on its hills between the salt sound on the one side and the fresh lakes on the other, cut through with canals and bays and inlets, so that water was always at the foot of the street, always glinting between the buildings, always there when you crested a hill. Half the city could see the sound from somewhere, and the ferries were part of the everyday, not a novelty but a commute, the way a bus was elsewhere, carrying the folks who lived out on the islands and across the water into their work each gray morning and home again each gray night. To live in Seattle was to live with one foot in the water, always. The salt smell of it and the horns of the boats threaded right through the most ordinary day. But you couldn't stay uphill long in that town, because the water was always calling you back down. The town was built on the edge of it, tumbling down its hills to the shore of the bay, and everything in the end ran back down to the water. So back down we go, down the steep streets toward the waterfront, where the piers ran out over the bay on their old wooden pilings, and the gulls wheeled and cried, and the smell of salt and creosote and fish and diesel came up to meet you. And out past the pier ends, the gray sound stretched away to the gray islands under the gray sky. This was the working edge of the city, the piers and the docks and the ferry terminals. And tucked right in among them, out on Pier 54, was a place that every soul in Seattle knew and loved. And it belonged to a man named Ivar. Ivar Haglund. Now there was a Seattle character for you, a folk singer and a showman and a genius of ballyhoo, who'd opened up the city's very first aquarium out on that pier before the war, and noticed that the folks who came to gawk at his fish got hungry and started ladling out clam chowder and frying up fish and chips to feed them, and never looked back. Ivar's acres of clams, he called it, right there on the pier, and over it he hung his motto, which tells you everything you need to know about the man. Keep clam. You'd come in out of the wet and the cold and sit by a window looking out over the gray water with the ferries crossing, and they'd bring you a bowl of clam chowder so hot it steamed your glasses, thick and white and full of clams and potato, with a pat of butter melting gold on the top of it, and a scatter of oyster crackers, and a squirt of Ivar's chowder for the fish and chips wrapped in paper. And you'd eat it looking out at the sound, and the gulls would beg at the window, and it would be, on a cold, wet Seattle afternoon, about as warm and as happy as a person could hope to be. Ivar fed that town for generations, and made it laugh while he did it. And there is not a Seattleite of a certain age who can smell clam chowder and not think of that pier, and that gray water, and that daft, wonderful sign. And Ivar's was only one stop along that whole wonderful working waterfront. The piers ran out over the bay one after another, and each had its own life. There was the old curiosity shop down there that had been startling visitors since before the turn of the century, crammed to the rafters with the strangest things a sailor ever hauled home from the far corners of the earth. The shrunken heads and the mummies, and the two-headed calf, and the whalebone, and 1,000 other wonders, half of them humbug, and every one of them glorious. A free museum of the weird for any kid with the nerve to walk in. There were the import shops, and the fish bars, and the fireboat at its moorings, and the great green and white ferries coming and going from the terminal with their car decks and their long, low horns. You could stand at the rail on the waterfront and watch the whole commerce of the Sound go by. The ferries, the freighters, the fishing boats, the tugs hauling their log rafts and their barges. The whole town's living moving on that gray water, right there in front of you, in the drizzle and the wheeling gulls. And it was about then, like as not, about the time you were mopping the last of the chowder with the last of the bread, that it would happen. The thing you'd waited on all week. The rain would stop, not ease, stop. And the low gray ceiling that had sat over the town for days would crack open somewhere out over the ocean, and a great shaft of clean gold light would come pouring down through it onto the water. And the wet town would begin, everywhere at once, to shine. The wet streets shone. The wet green of the hills shone. The bay went from gray to a hammered silver blue. And every single person in that city would feel their heart lift right up out of their chest. Because you had waited for this. You had earned this. And here it was. That was the secret gift buried inside all that Seattle rain, that it made the sun, when it finally came, mean something, mean everything. In a town of endless sunshine, you never look up. In Seattle, when the sun broke through, the whole city stopped and turned its face to it like a field of flowers. And with that sun came the spring, all in a rush, the way it does up in the Northwest, the reward at the end of all that gray. The cherry trees broke into bloom, great pink and white clouds of blossom along the streets and the campus and the parks, dropping their petals into the puddles. The rhododendrons came on heavy, the state's own flower, banks of them in every dooryard, red and pink and white, the blossoms big as dinner plates. Up north in the valley, the tulip fields opened all at once into great blocks of pure color you could see for miles, red and yellow running clear to the foot of the mountains. And the whole green town that had sulked so long under its gray blanket threw itself into the light. The gardens dug, the lawns mowed wet, the windows thrown open, the children turned loose. A green town is only green because it rains. That was the bargain Seattle made. And on a bright spring day, with the blossom everywhere and the mountain out and the whole world washed clean and shining, you'd have said it was the best bargain anybody ever struck. Do you remember rain that made the sun mean something? A whole gray, patient, wet green world, and then the light and the blossom and the lifting of the heart. That was spring in Seattle, and it was just beginning. And we've only walked the heart of the town so far, the market and the stores and the pier and the rain. We haven't yet gone up to see the thing this rainy little town was building, the wild, bright dream it was reaching for right out there against that gray sky. That's tomorrow. For now, stand a minute in that sudden gold light on the wet waterfront, with the chowder warm in you, and the gulls crying, and the ferries blowing far out on the bright water, and let the whole green town shine. It had been waiting all week for this, so had you. So now let's go and see the dream. Because we've walked the old heart of the town, the market and the rain and the pier, the Seattle that had always been. But there was one spring in the 60s when that rainy, modest, hard-working little town did the most un-Seattle thing imaginable. It stood up in front of the whole world and threw itself a party about the future. It built a World's Fair, and nothing was ever quite the same again. It opened on the 21st of April in 1962, and they called it the Century 21 Exposition. Century 21, you understand, because the whole idea of it, the whole theme, was tomorrow. The space age, the atom, the world that was coming. And on that first day, in that famously rainy town, 51,000 people poured through the gates. 51,000 on day one. And they kept coming, all spring, all summer, into the fall. And by the time the fair closed its gates 6 months later, near 10 million people had come to see it. 10 million. To a city of barely more than 500,000 souls. The whole country came, and a good part of the world besides. All of them riding the trains and driving the new highways and flying in on the new jets to little far-off rainy Seattle, of all places, to see the future. And Seattle, who had always thought of itself as the overlooked stepchild in the corner, the town nobody back east could quite find on a map, could hardly believe its own good luck. And the thing they came to see, the thing that rose up over the whole fair and over the whole city and stands there still, was the needle, the Space Needle. Now, you have to understand what a strange and daring and slightly crazy thing that was to build. 605 feet of it straight up into that low gray sky, a slender tapering tower on 3 great legs, flaring out at the top into a flying saucer of a thing, with a restaurant up there that turned slowly all the way around, once an hour, so that you could eat your dinner and watch the whole city and the whole sound and the whole ring of mountains wheel silently past your window. It cost $6.5 million, which was a fortune, and it was privately built. And right up until the end, plenty of level-headed people said it was madness, that it would fall over, that nobody would pay to ride an elevator up a glorified flagpole. And instead it became, the very instant it was finished, the thing that meant Seattle, the way the Eiffel Tower means Paris. A shape you could draw in 3 lines that the whole world knew. You'd ride up in the elevator, up through the gray, your ears popping, and step out at the top, and there was the whole world laid out below you. The city on its hills, the ferries drawing their white wakes across the Sound, the islands, the shipping, and away to the southeast, if the day was kind, the great white mountain floating over all of it. Folks who'd lived their whole lives down in that town at ground level came up the Needle and saw for the very first time where it was they actually lived. And it took their breath clean away. And if you were flush, or if it was an anniversary, or a young man's big night to impress a girl, you rode all the way up and had your dinner in that revolving restaurant, turning slow above the city. You'd sit at the window with your prime rib and your baked Alaska, and over the course of the meal, the whole world would come around to you. The downtown towers, then the black Sound with the ferry lights crawling across it, then the dark shapes of the islands, then the mountains, and then the city again, the entire town making one slow, complete circle past your table while you ate. There were folks who saved for months for that dinner and dressed in their very best for it, and remembered it the rest of their lives. For one turning hour, it felt like dining at the very top of the future itself. And to get you out to the fairgrounds to see it all, they built another piece of pure tomorrow, the Monorail. A sleek, single-railed train, elevated, silent, gliding along above the traffic on a concrete beam, running from downtown straight out to the fair in about a minute and a half. And it looked like something lifted right off the cover of a science fiction magazine. The children could not get enough of it. Better than 3 of every 4 people who came to that fair rode the monorail. Near 7.5 million of them, swept along above the streets like passengers out of the year 2000. And every single one of them climbed off, grinning. That was the whole genius of that fair, you see. It didn't just tell you about the future, it let you ride it. And oh, what a future it was, spread out across those grounds. There was the great arched Colosseum, and the Science Pavilion with its soaring white arches like something out of a space cathedral, where you could walk through the story of the atom and the stars. There was a bubble-shaped elevator, a clear plastic sphere, that lifted you up into the World of Tomorrow exhibit. The Bubbleator, they called it, and a fellow in a spacesuit ran it. There was the great international fountain throwing its water and its lights into the air in time to music. There was the Gayway, the amusement end of it with the rides and the games. There was a whole food circus under one roof where you could eat your way around the world. And over it all, the flags of all the nations, and the crowds in their spring coats, and the fountains and the music, and that slender tower turning against the clouds, the whole thing lit up at night into a city of the future, dropped down into a rainy old timber town. Even Elvis Presley came and made a picture there, singing his way through the fairgrounds with the Needle behind him. For 6 months, Little Seattle was the most modern, most talked about, most hopeful spot on the whole face of the earth. And a body could make a whole day of it and never see the same thing twice. Down at the Gayway, the amusement end, the rides spun and the barkers hollered and the kids blew their allowance on the games. Over at the food circus, all under one great roof, you could eat your way clear around the world. Foods you'd never heard of from countries you couldn't have found on a map. A Belgian waffle buried in strawberries and cream, cotton candy, things fried on sticks, a scoop of ice cream shaped like the future. And the foreign pavilions, each nation showing off its best, so that a farm kid from the dry side of the state who'd never been anywhere could walk through the whole wide world in a single afternoon. For a child, it was very near too much wonder to hold, and running through every bit of it was the space age, because that was the whole dream of that fair, and the timing could not have been better. For that very spring, just weeks before the gates opened, an astronaut named John Glenn had gone up and circled the whole Earth and come home safe. And the country was fairly drunk on the future, on rockets and satellites and the moon a young president had just promised we would reach. And here was the fair to show it all to you. The world of tomorrow, the car of the future, the kitchen of the future, the home of the future, all gleaming plastic and push buttons and impossible promises. They told you that by the year 2000, that far-off, magical science fiction year 2000, we would all be living like this, clean and easy and modern, our every trouble solved by science. And standing there in the rain, in a town of fishermen and mill hands, you could believe it. Lord, how you wanted to believe it. The children's own favorite of all those marvels was a clear bubble of an elevator, a great transparent sphere they called the Bubbleator, that a fellow in a silver spacesuit would pack full of wide-eyed folks and lift up, slow, into the World of Tomorrow exhibit, while a great voice boomed out about the century to come. You rode up inside a soap bubble into the future. To a 10-year-old in the spring of that year, there was nothing on all the earth that could top it. And grown men still grin like boys, remembering the day they got to ride the Bubbleator up into tomorrow, and you had to see it after dark. When the gray day faded, the whole fair lit up, the needle strung with light and crowned with a torch of flame, the fountains shooting colored water up into the black, the pavilions glowing, the monorail sliding past, all lit from within. The whole grounds turned into a shimmering electric city of tomorrow, doubled in the wet pavement. Young couples walked it slow, arm in arm in the soft rain. Children rode their father's shoulders, heavy-eyed and flatly refusing to go home. And that slender tower turned and turned against the low clouds, lit up like a promise, and the whole rainy town lay glittering around it. And for those few hours, you would have sworn you were standing at the exact bright center of the whole wide, hopeful world. And for the children of that town, and of that whole far corner of the country, the fair was the field trip of a lifetime, the thing you'd talk about for years after on the playground. The school buses rolled in from all over the state, from the wheat towns and the timber towns and the fishing towns, loads of kids in their good clothes with their sack lunches and their wide eyes, herded through the science pavilion and up the Needle and onto the monorail, and sent home at dusk, sticky and worn out and quietly changed, having seen, for one single day, that the world was bigger and stranger and far more full of promise than their own small, rainy corner of it had ever let on. A thing like that lodges in a child and never quite comes loose. There are old men and women all across this country tonight who saw the future at that fair when they were 10 years old and have been chasing it quietly ever since. And you should have seen how it opened. On that first day, they filled Memorial Stadium and put on a show worthy of the dream. There were water skiers cutting figures around a course flooded into the stadium floor, and an aerialist who rode a motorcycle across a high wire strung all the way from the stadium up to the Space Needle, hundreds of feet in the air, with no net and the whole crowd holding its breath. And then, at the great moment, the president himself, all the way back in Florida, touched a golden key wired to the heavens. Some said it caught a signal from a star, and the fair sprang to life, the fountains leaping, the bells ringing across the city, and 10 United States Air Force jets came screaming low over the fairgrounds in tight formation, the thunder of them rolling off the hills and shaking the rain right out of the sky. The space age, the jet age, the American century, all of it roaring straight overhead. There were grown men that day who wept because their overlooked little rain-soaked town had just announced itself to the whole wide world, and the world had come, and the world was impressed. Now, the fair ran only 6 months, and then it closed. But here is the good part, the part that made it more than a party. It didn't all get torn down and hauled away the way most World's Fairs do. When the gates closed for the last time, the grounds stayed. They became Seattle Center, the Needle, the Coliseum, the Fountain, the Monorail. The whole heart of it kept and given back to the people as the city's own front yard forever. And so a Seattle child growing up in the years after the fair got to grow up in the future. That was your playground. You rode the monorail because it was just the train, and you ran through the International Fountain in your bathing suit on a hot day and shrieked when the water came. And you went up the Needle for your birthday, and you never once thought it was anything special. It was just your town, the town that had reached up and grabbed hold of tomorrow and kept it. But a Seattle spring had older joys than the fair, and gentler ones, and you didn't have to pay a gate to get them. And the best of them was to get out on the water. So let's leave the fairgrounds and go down to the ferry dock, because half the fun of that town was the ferry. The great green and white boats of the state ferry fleet crossed and recrossed Puget Sound all day and half the night, carrying the cars and the walk-on riders over to the islands and across to the far shore. And a ride on one was the finest cheap pleasure the whole region had to offer. You'd drive your car right up into the belly of the boat, or walk on with your coat collar up, and climb to the top deck, and the ferry would pull out from the pier with a great low blast of its horn, that mournful, beautiful sound that carried for miles across the water, and that every soul who ever lived near that sound hears still in their dreams. And out you'd go, out across the gray-green water, the gulls hanging right off the stern for the bread the children threw, the wind and the salt in your face, the wooded islands sliding by, the city and its brand-new Needle shrinking behind you, and the great ring of white mountains standing all around the horizon. A cup of coffee and a donut from the galley, an hour on the water for pocket change, the horn echoing off the hills. There was no better way to spend a bright spring afternoon, and there still isn't, and any Seattleite will tell you so. And every ferry went somewhere worth going. There were the green islands scattered all across the Sound, each with its own small towns and farms and beaches, close enough to see from the city and yet a whole world away, a slower, older, quieter world of orchards and clam beds and little harbors, reached only by boat. Folks lived out there and rode the ferry into work of a morning. Folks in the city took the ferry out on a Sunday for a picnic or a drive. Sweethearts rode it back and forth for no reason on earth but the being together on the water. The boat was the bridge, and the boat was the escape, both at the same time. And on a clear spring evening, coming back in toward the city with the sun going down red behind the jagged Olympic Mountains, and the lights of Seattle coming up ahead, and the Needle standing over all of it, a ferry ride home was about as close to grace as a nickel could ever buy. Now that's the daytime. But the young people, the teenagers, they had a whole world of their own by the 60s, and it ran at night, and it ran on music. Because a whole scrappy, wild, wonderful music scene had grown up in those rainy towns around the Sound. Garage bands by the hundred, kids with cheap guitars and cheaper amplifiers making a raw, loud, fuzzy racket in basements and garages all over the region. And out of all of it came one song that was, and is, the anthem of the whole Northwest. Louie Louie. Now, plenty of folks think of that as somebody else's song, but the truth is it was cut first and best right here. A band from just down the road in Tacoma called the Fabulous Wailers recorded it, and it went straight to #1 on KJR, Seattle's own big rock and roll station, and became the roaring three-chord heart of Northwest rock and roll before the wider world ever caught up to it. And it was only the start. The armories and the dance halls and the roller rinks on a Saturday night were packed with sweating teenagers and shaking with the sound of local bands, The Sonics, out of Tacoma, playing louder and rawer and wilder than just about anybody in America. A fuzzed-out, screaming, stomping sound that folks would still be arguing about and imitating 50 years on. The grown-ups thought it was a terrible noise. The grown-ups were, as usual, missing the point entirely. And that music was everywhere a kid turned. It came screaming out of the car radio, tuned to KJR, where the disc jockeys were local heroes. A fellow like Pat O'Day, spinning the hits and running the dances, and telling a whole generation of Northwest teenagers what was cool. It came out of the record shops downtown, where you'd flip through the bins of 45s with your friends on a Saturday and spend your very last dollar on the newest single and rush home to wear it out. And it came, loud and live and sweating, out of the dances themselves. For that was where a Northwest teenager truly lived on a Saturday night. At the dance, in some armory or Grange Hall or roller rink, packed in shoulder to shoulder to a live band. Or out cruising in a friend's car, up and down the strip with the windows down and the radio up, seeing and being seen. Or parked at the drive-in, the great screen glowing out in the wet dark. A carload of kids and a speaker hooked on the window, and the picture only half watched. There was a whole teenage world out there in the rainy nights of the 60s. The leather jackets and the ponytails, the go-go boots and the pocket transistor radios, the first cigarette and the first kiss and the first heartbreak. The same as it was all over America, but with the drizzle on the windshield and the smell of the evergreens and the salt water, and that raw local garage sound thumping away under all of it. And there was a boy in all of that, a shy left-handed kid from right there in Seattle, who'd grown up poor in that town and taught himself the guitar upside down and backward, and haunted these very clubs and dances, soaking it all up. A boy named Jimi Hendrix. He'd leave before long and go out into the wider world and change what a guitar could even be, and burn across the whole decade like a comet. But he started right here, a Seattle kid in the rain, one more boy with a cheap guitar and an impossible dream. In a town that was suddenly, that decade, teaching everybody that impossible dreams were the local specialty. And the town got other new toys to be proud of, too. In 1967, the city landed its very own big league basketball team. And what did they name it? The Supersonics. The Sonics. Named of all things for the supersonic transport, the great faster-than-sound jet that Boeing was going to build right there, and that was going to carry the whole town into the future along with it. Even the ball team was named after the dream. And on a wet night, you could still do the oldest thing there was, too. Go down to the show house, the movie palace downtown, or the neighborhood theater, and settle into the dark for the Saturday feature. And like as not, there'd be a Western up on the screen, a big John Wayne picture. The Duke riding tall through some dry, sunlit country that felt like the far side of the moon from all that Seattle rain, and the whole house happy as could be. There were older games in that town, too, that a family loved. Out at the old ballpark, the Rainiers played their minor league baseball on the green grass under the gray sky, a nickel bag of peanuts and an afternoon off. And for a single summer season at the end of the decade, the town even had itself a big league team of its own, before it slipped away again to another city. And come the warm weather, the whole town would turn out along the shores of Lake Washington to watch the great roaring hydroplanes tear around their course, throwing up their rooster tails of spray, the one day a year that quiet, modest town let itself get truly, gloriously loud. There was always something. A boat race, a ball game, a band, a fair, a ferry, some good cheap way to be out among your neighbors under that soft gray sky on the good green edge of the country. So that was where the fun was, in Seattle, in the spring of the 60s, up the Needle and out on the Sound, and into the roar of a garage band on a Saturday night. A rainy little town that had grabbed hold of the future with both hands and wasn't about to let go. Let the fair lights burn against the low sky. Let the last monorail glide home and the last ferry blast its horn far out on the dark water, and the last garage band pack up its amps and the drizzle come drifting back down over all of it. It had been a bright and hopeful day and a bright and hopeful time. Tomorrow we'll go and see the hard work that paid for all this wonder, the fish and the timber, and the great company whose wings the whole town was riding. But tonight, just look at those lights and that tower, and believe, the way the whole town believed, that the best was still to come. So come back with me now, and come back early, before the fair opens its gates and the monorail starts its run, back into the gray dark before the dawn. Because all that shining wonder we walked through yesterday, all that talk of the future, rested on something. It rested on work. Hard, cold, dangerous, unglamorous work, done by people who mostly never rode the Bubbleator or dined up the Needle. Somebody caught the fish and felled the timber and, most of all, built the airplanes. Let's go find them in the dark before the light comes up. Start where the whole town's paycheck started, out at the great plants where they built the airplanes, because this was Jet City, and don't you forget it. Boeing. In that decade there was Seattle and there was Boeing, and it was very nearly impossible to say where the one left off and the other began. The company had built the 707, the airplane that opened the whole jet age, that took a world that had crossed the ocean by ship in a week and let it cross by air in hours, and shrank the whole planet down, and it built that airplane right there on the edge of that rainy town. And the work of it was enormous. Boeing's payroll had passed 100,000 souls, and across the boom of the mid-60s it very nearly doubled again, so that in a town of 500,000 people, it seemed like every family had somebody on at Boeing. A father, an uncle, a brother, a neighbor. And the ones who didn't work there themselves worked at the places that fed and clothed and served the ones who did. When Boeing hired, the whole town prospered. When Boeing sneezed, the whole town caught cold. That was the deal, and nobody thought much about the danger in it, because in those years Boeing did nothing but hire. And it was two towns in one, really, out at Boeing. There were the engineers, the college men, thousands of them, with their slide rules and their white shirts and their pocket protectors, the ones who dreamed the airplanes up and drew them out and did the sums that kept them in the sky. A whole quiet army of careful, brilliant people drawn to Seattle from all over the country to do the hardest thinking of the age. And there were the machinists and the tradesmen, the union men, tens of thousands of them, who took those drawings and turned them into aluminum and steel and made them real, out on the floor, with their hands. The slide rules and the wrenches didn't always love one another, but they built the jet age together, shift after shift, and they knew it. And there was a rough, shared pride running through the whole place. It was a company town without quite being one, a company that had itself a whole city, and a city that had, in the end, the one company, for better and, as we'll come to see, for worse. Come to the plant gates in the gray before dawn and watch them come in, the great shifts of them, thousands upon thousands, in their work clothes with their lunch pails and their thermoses, streaming in from the parking lots that went on for acres, under the lights, into those enormous buildings you could have fit the whole downtown inside of. And inside, the work. The machinists and the riveters and the wiremen and the engineers building the most complicated machines that human beings had ever made, by hand, piece by piece, rivet by rivet, mile after mile of aluminum and wire coming together into a thing that would carry 400 strangers up over the weather at the speed of sound. There is a particular pride in that kind of work that people who've never done it can't quite feel. To stand at the end of a shift, bone-tired, and watch a finished airplane, a thing you helped build with your own 2 hands, get towed out onto the field. And then one day to see it in the sky, high up, drawing its long white line across the blue, and to be able to say quietly, to nobody in particular, "I built that." The whole town could say it. The whole town had a hand in the wings the whole country was flying on. And by the end of the 60s, they were building a new one out there, a giant, the biggest airplane the world had ever seen, the 747. And the confidence of it, the sheer roaring optimism of that company and that town, seemed like it could never end. But hold that thought, and hold it gently. And let's leave the plants for now and go to the water. Because Boeing was the new money, the jet age money. But there was older work in that town, work as old as the town itself. And it smelled of salt and fish and diesel. And it was out at Ballard. Now Ballard was a town within the town. It had been its own city once, before Seattle swallowed it. And it was, top to bottom, Scandinavian. Norwegian mostly, with Swedes and Danes and Finns mixed in. The sons and grandsons of people who'd come across from the old country, because the deep, cold, fjord-cut coast of the Northwest looked and felt like home. And because they knew, in their bones and their blood, how to wrest a living out of a cold northern sea. And that is exactly what they did. Ballard was the heart of the fishing fleet, the boats tied up thick along the docks, the canneries, the net sheds, the shipyards, the whole hard salt business of going down to the sea for a living. The Norwegian families ran it, boat and cannery and union hall, and they chased the cod and the halibut, and above all, the salmon, not just in the Sound, but all the way up the long, wild coast to Alaska and back, gone for the whole season, the men away north on the water while the town waited. And it wasn't only the men, and it wasn't only the boats. The canneries ran the whole season through, great sheds along the water where the salmon came in by the ton to be cleaned and cut and packed into cans and shipped out to feed the world. And the lines were worked by women, mostly, hour after cold, wet hour, their hands raw and their aprons bloody, fast and skilled and uncomplaining, earning a wage that helped hold a fishing family together through a hard year. Whole crews of cannery workers shipped north to Alaska for the run, too, and lived rough in the camps for the season and came home with their pay. It was cold, bloody, endless work, and it fed a good part of the country. And the folks who did it were about as far from the shining needle as you could get and still stand in the same town. But it was the same town. The fish on the nation's table and the jet in the nation's sky came out of the same rainy corner, off the same working hands. And down along the central waterfront, between the fishing docks and the ferry piers, ran the working port itself. The deep-water piers where the freighters tied up, the cranes, the warehouses, the railroad tracks running right out onto the docks. Seattle was a gateway, a saltwater door to Alaska and to the whole Pacific and the Far East beyond. And the goods of the world moved across those docks, the lumber and the wheat and the salmon going out, the cargo coming in from across the ocean. And the longshoremen worked it, a tough, proud, tight-knit union breed, gangs of them loading and unloading by hook and by sling and by sweat in every kind of weather, the ships coming and going with the tides. It was one more of the old hard trades the shining new city rested on and mostly forgot to thank. The men on the docks, moving the world's freight, down at the foot of the streets where the town met the sea. And it was dangerous work, make no mistake, the most dangerous work there was. The North Pacific is a cold and a cruel sea, and it took its toll every year, some years worse than others. A boat that didn't come back, a man washed off a deck in a blow, a whole crew lost in the cold gray water. Every fishing town on that coast had its widows and its empty chairs, and Ballard had its share. And the Lutheran churches were full on a Sunday of people praying for the men who were away on the water, and full again, too often, for the ones who didn't come home. But they went out anyway, season after season, generation after generation, because it was who they were, and it was the only life they knew and wanted. The highliners, they called the great fishermen, the ones who always came back with the fullest hold. And a Ballard boy grew up on those docks, knowing that one day he'd go north too, and mostly proud of it. It was a hard, cold, salt-cured, close-knit, deeply Scandinavian world, tucked right there in the corner of the modern jet-age city, keeping the old ways and the old tongue and the old faith, 1 foot always in the cold sea. And Ballard lived like the old country, right down its main street. Along Ballard Avenue and the blocks around it stood the Scandinavian bakeries with the cardamom bread and the lefse, the shops that sold the goods from home, the Lutheran churches with the services still given in Norwegian, the Sons of Norway Hall where the lodge met and the old dances were danced. The coffee was always on, good, strong Scandinavian coffee, poured all day long in the kitchens and the church basements and the backs of the shops, because that was the Nordic way. At Christmas there was lutefisk, that cod cured in lye that the young folks could hardly stand and the old folks would not do without. And they kept the old holidays and the old songs and a good deal of the old tongue, so that a child of Ballard grew up half in America and half in a Norway he had never seen, and carried the both of them his whole life. It was the warmest, tightest, most deeply rooted little world, tucked right there behind the fishing docks in the rain. And right there at Ballard was one of the little wonders of that town, a place where you could stand and watch two of its worlds meet, and it was worth an afternoon of any child's life. The locks. The Ballard locks. You see, they'd cut a canal years back to join the salt water of the Sound to the fresh water of the lakes inland, and the two sat at different levels. So they built the locks to raise and lower the boats between them, like a great water elevator. And you could go and stand at the rail and watch it work all day, the fishing boats and the pleasure boats and the tugs crowding into the great concrete chamber, and the gates closing, and the water rushing in or out, and the whole raft of boats rising or sinking right before your eyes. The fishermen coasting in from the sea lifted gently back up to the level of the town. And best of all, right alongside, they'd built a fish ladder, a stair-stepped channel of water with windows down below the surface, so that the salmon coming back in from the ocean to swim up to the streams where they were born to spawn could climb, leap by leap, up past the locks. And you could go down into a cool, dim room and press your face to the glass and watch them. The great salmon, battered and silver and driven, hanging in the green water, gathering themselves, and then hurling up over the next step, one after another, on the last mad, heroic push home to the very gravel where they'd hatched, to spawn and to die. A child could watch that for hours. It taught you something, though you couldn't have said what, something about coming home, and about the price of it that stayed with you long after. And the great rhythm of that whole Ballard world was the leaving and the coming home. In the spring, the fleet made ready, the boats hauled out and painted, the engines gone over, the nets mended in the long net sheds, the gear and the grub loaded aboard, and then, on a gray morning, The boats would slip their lines and head north, up the inside passage toward Alaska, and be gone. Gone for months. And the town would settle into its waiting, the wives running the households and the shops, the children counting off the weeks, the whole community holding its breath through the season, watching the weather, dreading the call that meant a boat was lost. And then, come the fall, they'd come home, riding low and heavy with a good season, or riding high and grim with a poor one. And the whole town would come down to the docks, and there'd be reunions and money and relief and grief all mixed together on those wet planks, and the long, dark winter to rest and mend before it all began over again. That was a fishing family's year. That was a fishing town's heartbeat, in and out like the tide, like the salmon, like the breath of the cold sea itself. And it was never only the Scandinavians either, on the water and in the sheds, for all that Ballard was their town. The canneries and the fields and the docks of that whole region were worked by people from every corner of the earth who'd been drawn to the edge of the Pacific. The Filipino crews who followed the salmon north to the Alaska canneries year after year. The Japanese and Chinese families who had farmed the valleys and fished the Sound for generations. The native people who had worked those waters since long before any city stood there at all. It was hard, humble, essential work, shared out among folks who, up on the surface of the town, often kept to their own kind, but who, down at the level of the labor, out on the cold water and along the cannery line, all did the same back-breaking thing, side by side, to feed the same country. The Northwest was built by a great many hands, from a great many places, and it is only right to say so. And all those boats had to be built and kept, so Ballard had its shipyards too, down along Salmon Bay, the ways and the dry docks where the wooden fishing boats were built and hauled out and mended. The smell of oakum and tar and fresh sawn planking, the shipwrights who could shape a hull by eye. A good boat was a family's whole living and half its heart, named for a wife or a daughter, babied and blessed. And the men who built them and mended them were craftsmen of the first order, working in wood the old way, on the edge of the water, in the rain. Now the fish and the airplanes, that was the 60s. But there was one more layer under even the fish, the very bottom layer, the thing the whole city had grown up out of in the first place. And to find it, you had to go down to the oldest part of town, down to Pioneer Square, down by the water, where Seattle began. Because before the fish and long before the jets, this was a timber town. That was the beginning of all of it. Back in the frontier days, a man named Henry Yesler had built a steam sawmill down there on the waterfront. And the great fir and cedar of those hills, some of the biggest, finest timber on the face of the earth, was cut up in the hills above and sent down to his mill to be sawn into the lumber that built the whole young city and got shipped out to build a good deal of the rest of the coast besides. And the way they got those great logs down the steep hill to the mill was to skid them, to drag them down a long, greased corridor of smaller logs laid crossways, a skid road. And that road, that original skid road down to Yesler's mill, is still there, still called Yesler Way. And here's a thing worth knowing. It gave the whole English language a phrase. Because the rough end of that road, down by the mill, where the mill hands and the loggers and the drifters and the down and out gathered in the saloons and the flop houses, that came to be called the Skid Road. And from there the words passed into the language for the hard luck end of any town, anywhere. Skid Row. It started right there, on that hill, with those logs. And what timber it had been. The hills all around that Sound had been carpeted, before the town, in a forest out of a dream. Douglas fir and red cedar and hemlock, grown 1,000 years. Some so big around that it took a dozen men joining hands to circle one. Trees 300 feet tall, the greatest forest of its kind on the earth. And the loggers went up into it and brought it down in the camps back in the hills with the cross-cut saws and the axes and the oxen and later the steam donkeys. some of the hardest and most dangerous work this country has ever asked of a man. The fallers notching those giants and springing clear as they came down with a crash that shook the ground for a mile. It built the town, and it built fortunes, and it fed the mills whose whine and whose sweet smell of fresh-cut fur hung over the whole waterfront for 100 years. By the 60s, the greatest of the old forest was long gone, cut, and the trade had moved on and changed. But the whole city stood, quite literally, on what those loggers had felled, and half the old families in it could trace back to some man who'd come out west to work in the woods. And by the 60s, Pioneer Square, that oldest heart of the city, had come down in the world. The grand old stone and brick buildings from the boom days were still standing, handsome as ever under their cornices, but the money and the life had moved uptown and out to the suburbs decades before, and left the old quarter down at heel and half forgotten. The cheap hotels, the missions, the taverns, the old men on the benches under the iron pergola, the pigeons, the rain. It was the far end of the old skid road, and it looked it. And yet there was a beauty in it still, and a history in every stone, and a scattering of people even then who could see it, who looked at those fine old neglected buildings and, the way those friends had looked at the market, saw not a slum to be cleared, but a treasure to be saved. Their fight would come a little later. But the bones of the old town were down there, waiting, holding the whole long story. The timber that started it, the mill, the skid road, the very spot where a rainy little lumber camp had first dreamed of becoming a city. You could still read the whole story down there, if you knew where to look. There was the old iron and glass pergola on the corner where the gentleman had once waited for the cable car. There was a great totem pole the city had raised in the square long before, a reminder of the native people whose land this had been from the very beginning, and who were still there, still fishing the rivers as they always had, in the face of everything. And there was a whole hidden city underground down there, the old street level from before a great fire, buried when they raised the streets, the original storefronts still standing in the dark beneath the sidewalks. It was a haunted, handsome, down-on-its-luck old quarter, full of ghosts and pigeons and history and rain. And it was the root of the whole thing. Every shining tower uptown, every jet out at Boeing, every fair with all its talk of the future had grown, in the end, out of that muddy little skid road down by the water, where the logs first came sliding down to the sea. So there it is, the 3 ages of the town's work, all going at once in that one decade. The loggers and the mill that made it, the fishermen who worked the cold sea and always had, and the great jet company that the whole modern town was riding on into the future. It was all hard, and a good deal of it was cold and dangerous and done in the dark and the wet, and none of it ever rode the monorail or dined up the needle. But it was the true engine under all that shine, the calloused hands and the salt-stiff nets, and the aluminum and the rivets, and every bright thing we walked through yesterday was bought and paid for by it. Did you ever do work like that? Real work, hard work, the kind that built or caught or made a true thing, the kind you could point to? A great many of us did, once, and we're proud of it, and there was a dignity in it that the world has been letting slip. Let the dark come down now over the plants and the docks and the old skid road, over the men coming off the late shift and the boats riding at their moorings, and the salmon resting in the dark green water at the foot of the ladder. Tomorrow is Sunday, our last day in this green, rainy town, the day it laid down its hard work and turned toward the things it loved, and the day, though nobody knew it, that the future it had reached for so hopefully would begin, quietly, to slip out of its hands. But rest here a minute first, in the working dark, and think kindly on the hands that built the wings. So here we are, the last day. And in Seattle, the last day begins the way so many of its days began, in the soft gray rain on a quiet Sunday morning, with the whole green town at rest. We've walked the market and the pier, we've ridden the needle and the ferry and the roar of a garage band. We've stood in the working dark with the men who built the wings and caught the fish. Now let's stand still on a rainy Sunday and look at the soul of the place, what these rain country people loved and believed and held on to, and then, gently, we'll have to say goodbye. The rain on a Sunday morning was a different rain somehow, softer, slower, in no hurry at all. The whole town given the day off from itself. And out into it, from every neighborhood on every hill, the people went to church. The plain wooden churches and the great stone ones, the Catholic and the Lutheran and the Baptist and the rest. The bells ringing wet and muffled across the valleys between the hills. The families walking under their umbrellas, the ones who used umbrellas, up the puddled sidewalks to worship. And nowhere was that Sunday faith deeper or more its own than out in Ballard, among the Scandinavian fishing families, where the Lutheran churches were the very center of the community's life, and where a good part of the prayers, that whole decade through, were for the men who were away on the cold water, and for the ones who had not come home from it. The rain, the bells, the gray light through the windows, the old hymns, some of them still sung in Norwegian, and outside, always, the sound of the water and the far horn of a ferry. That was a Seattle Sunday, gray and quiet and deep. And when church let out, the Sunday belonged to the family and to the outdoors, because a Seattle family loved to be out in it, rain or shine, but especially when a bit of sun came through. There was the Sunday drive out along the lake or up into the foothills, the whole family in the car just to see the country. There was the ferry taken for no reason but the pleasure of it, over to an island and back, a picnic packed in a basket. There were the great green parks the city had been wise enough to keep, the lake shores, the wooded boulevards, the rose gardens, where folks walked and fed the ducks and let the children run. This was an outdoors people at heart. They had settled at the foot of the mountains and the edge of the Sound because they loved the wild green world. And a Sunday was for getting back out into it, in a good coat with your family, under the dripping trees. For it was a beautiful town just to be in the plainest daily way. It was built on hills, steep ones, so that the streets ran up and over them, and the water in the mountains kept appearing at the ends of them, sudden and free. Between the houses, you'd crest a hill on your way to the store, and there'd be the whole Sound spread out silver below you, the ferries and the islands. And you'd catch your breath, though you'd seen it 10,000 times. The houses climbed the hills with their porches facing the water, and a person of the most ordinary means, in the most ordinary house, could have a view out the kitchen window that a rich man elsewhere would have paid a fortune for. The water, the boats, the green islands, and the mountain when it chose to show. That was the daily wealth of that rainy town, free to everybody. You lived inside a postcard, and mostly you were far too busy to notice, until a clear evening stopped you at the top of a hill and reminded you where you were. And they were good neighbors in that quiet northwest way, not the loud, over-the-fence, in-your-business kind, but a steadier, more reserved neighborliness, slow to warm and then true for life. They'd not intrude on you, but they'd be there in a hard time without being asked, with a casserole and a hand, and no fuss made about it. The neighborhoods held together, the corner store, the school, the church, the tavern where the men had a beer after the shift. It was a modest town, and it knew it was modest, and there was a grace in that, a lack of show that the flashier cities never had. They were water people and rain people and mountain people, keeping their own council up there in the corner of the map, looking after their own, and mostly content to be overlooked. Right up until the spring, they threw open a World's Fair, and for 6 startling months were overlooked no longer. But a Sunday in spring could break wide open into something joyful, too. And there was one day in particular that all of Ballard lived for. The 17th of May. Syttende Mai, Norwegian Constitution Day. The biggest day of the whole year in that Scandinavian town, when the old country came pouring right out into the streets. They'd throw a great parade, one of the biggest of its kind anywhere outside of Norway itself, straight down the main street of Ballard. The marching bands and the folk dancers and the children and the old people, all of them decked out in the bunad, the beautiful embroidered folk costumes brought over from home or sewn careful by hand here. The reds and blues and the silver, and everywhere, the flags. The red, white, and blue of Norway snapping in the wet spring wind, right alongside the stars and stripes. And the whole town turned out along the curbs, in the drizzle, not caring a bit about the drizzle, to watch their own go by, and to be, for one proud day, wholly and openly and joyfully what they were, Norwegians and Americans, and the people of Ballard, all three at once, out in the street together in the rain. There is nothing that holds a community together like a day when it stands up and says, out loud, in costume, with a brass band, "This is who we are." And oh, the food of that day, and of that whole Nordic world. The long tables would groan under the spread, the pickled herring and the cured salmon, the meatballs, the boiled potatoes, the flatbread, the brown cheese, the lefse rolled up with butter and sugar, the kringle and the almond cake and the cardamom buns, and the coffee, always the coffee, cup after cup of it, strong and hot, because a Scandinavian gathering ran on coffee the way an engine runs on oil. The Sons of Norway Hall would be packed and warm and loud with it. The old language and the old songs, 3 and 4 generations at the tables. The grandmother who'd crossed on the boat as a girl, holding hands with the grandchild who was pure American, over the lefse. It was the old country, kept alive by love and by butter and by sheer stubborn memory, in a rainy corner of a new land, one more spring. And then there were the days. You never knew when one was coming. That was the magic of it. When you'd walk outside into the gray, same as any other morning, and something would make you look up. And the gray would be breaking. And there, in a gap in the clouds where you'd have sworn there was nothing but more sky, hanging impossibly high over the rooftops, far higher than anything had a right to be, was the mountain. Rainier. 14,000 feet of white, a great slumbering snow-covered volcano 40 and more miles to the southeast. So huge and so high and so bright that the first time you saw it clear you could scarcely believe it was real, that it had been there all along behind the gray. And the whole city, all at once, all day, would say the same 3 words to one another. On the street, in the shops, over the fence, the mountain is out. That was all you had to say. The mountain is out. And everyone knew exactly what you meant, and everyone felt exactly the same lift of the heart. They called it simply the mountain, as if there were only the one in all the world, and to that town there was. It sat down there on the horizon, silent and enormous and eternal, watching over the whole rainy, hurrying human town. And on the days it showed itself, it made everybody stop and look up and feel small in the good way, the way the river had made you feel small, the way the truly great and lasting things always do. The needle was the tower the town built to be proud of. The mountain was the one that God built to keep them humble. And on a clear spring Sunday, with the ferry crossing the bright Sound and the mountain out over it all, there was not a more beautiful city on the face of the whole earth. And every soul in it knew it. And knew, too, how lucky they were to be there to see it. That mountain got into everything. It was on the postcards and the license plates. It was the thing every visitor was marched out to see, and every child drew in the corner of every picture. A white triangle over a blue line of water. Folks planned their whole weekends around it when it was out. The bold ones climbed it, roped their way up the glaciers to the summit and back, a hard and dangerous 2-day haul, and came home changed. But most just loved it from below, from the city, from the ferry, from the kitchen window, and never tired of it, and never once took it for granted. Because it wasn't out most days, it hid in the gray more often than not, and so every single time it showed itself was a gift, a small, unearned grace handed to a whole city at once. A place is lucky to have one great thing that belongs to everybody in it equally, rich and poor alike, that no one can buy or sell or fence off. Seattle had the mountain. It had done nothing at all to earn it but be lucky enough to be built where it could see it. And this was the spring of it all, remember? The season we'd chosen to walk. And spring, in that green country, was the whole town's reward and release. All that long gray winter of rain and dark, and then the light coming back, longer every evening, and the whole world breaking into bloom and leaf at once. The gardens that Seattle folk tended so lovingly, for they were great gardeners, a rain country people with green thumbs and mossy roofs, came roaring to life. The rhododendrons and the azaleas and the camellias, the fruit trees, the tulips and the daffodils. The children came off the porches and back out into the streets and the woods. The boats went back in the water. The mountains came clear of their winter cloud. And the whole town, that had spent months hunched and patient under its gray blanket, straightened up and lifted its face and remembered, all over again, exactly why it put up with all that rain. For this. Spring in Seattle was a thing you earned, and having earned it, you knew its worth in a way the sunny places never could. And the evenings were the best of it. For as the spring came on, the light stretched longer and longer, that far north light, so that by the edge of summer, it hung soft and gold in the sky until 9 and 10 o'clock at night, and a whole town that had huddled in the dark all winter came spilling back outdoors to drink it in. The lawns got mowed in the long evening. The children played ball in the street until they truly could not see the ball anymore, and got called in twice and came in once. The porches filled. Folks walked down to the water just to watch the light go, the Sound turning to pewter, and then to rose, and then to a deep blue-gray that never fully went dark. After all that gray, the long, bright evenings of a northwest spring felt like a door thrown wide open, like the whole year's worth of joy arriving at once. And everybody knew it wouldn't last long, the sun up there, and so they spent it the way you spend a thing you know to be precious, greedily and gratefully, and all the way down to the very last of the light. Now there was one more corner of that town we ought to walk through before the light goes, quietly and with respect, because it holds one of the town's deeper sorrows folded in among its life. Down near Pioneer Square, at the foot of the hills, was the district where the city's Asian families had made their home for generations. The Chinese and the Japanese and the Filipino community. The groceries and the restaurants and the family associations. The old men in the club rooms, the whole close-knit world of it. And it had suffered a wound that the pretty parts of the town never spoke of. For when the war came, the government had taken the Japanese families of that district, American families most of them, citizens, born right there, and put them on trains and sent them away to camps behind barbed wire in the empty desert for years, for no crime but their blood. They lost their homes, their shops, their farms, near everything they'd built. And when at last it was over and they were let go, a great many of them came quietly back to that district and started over from nothing, without complaint, and rebuilt their lives and their businesses in the same rainy streets, among neighbors, some of whom had stood by them and some of whom had not. By the 60s, it was a living neighborhood again, busy and proud. But the old folks remembered. That kind of thing settles into a place and stays under the surface, the way the drowned street stayed under Pioneer Square. And a town is made of its sorrows carried quietly, as much as of its joys sung out loud. And it is only right, on our last day, to stand a moment in that street too, and remember. But it was a living place too, that district, not only a wounded one, and full of its own rich life. The Chinese groceries with the strange, wonderful things in the windows, the dried fish and the herbs, and the barbecued ducks hanging in a row. The restaurants where the whole town came for a feast. The bakeries with the moon cakes and the almond cookies. The family associations and the club rooms where the old men played their games late into the night. And come the Lunar New Year, the district came alive with the firecrackers and the drums and the great dancing dragon winding down the street. The one time the quiet, hard-working community threw open its doors and invited the whole town in to celebrate. It had endured everything the century had thrown at it, the exclusion, the war, the camps, the slights, and it was still there, still cooking, still open, still keeping its festivals and raising its children. One more proud thread in the weave of that rainy town, and a lesson in how a people survives a hard history without letting it turn the heart to stone. And now I have to tell you the hard thing, the thing that gives this whole bright, hopeful story its ache. And I'll tell it gently, because nobody living it saw it coming. Cast your mind back to that fair, to the needle going up, and the monorail, and the 10 million, and the jets roaring overhead, and the whole rainy little town standing up and telling the world it was the city of Century 21, the city of the future. Remember how sure they were. Remember how the whole town rode on Boeing's wings, higher and higher through the whole shining decade, and how it seemed it could never end. And none of them knew. None of them, standing at that fair under those lights, had the faintest idea that the future they were reaching for so joyfully was going to turn around and very nearly break their hearts. Because at the end of the decade, the orders stopped. The great new airplane cost more to build than anyone had dreamed. The airlines stopped buying. The government cut the money for the supersonic jet the ball team was named after. And the company that was the whole town's heart began, all at once, to bleed. And Boeing let its people go, not by the hundreds, but by the tens of thousands. 25,000 jobs gone in 1 year, 41,000 more the next. Some 86,000 people in 3 years put out of work in a town that lived and died by that one company. The machinists and the engineers, the men who'd built the wings the whole country flew on. The men who'd stood at the end of a shift and said, "I built that," now standing in line for their unemployment, selling their houses, packing up their families, leaving the rainy town they loved because there was no more work in it. It was called the Boeing Bust, and it fell on that city like a long gray year that would not end. And in 1971, two fellows with a sad sense of humor rented a billboard out by the airport, out where the laid-off families drove past on their way out of town for good. And on it they put 6 words that said the whole thing. 6 words that have never been forgotten. Will the last person leaving Seattle turn out the lights? And they went. You'd see the for sale signs come up on street after street, whole neighborhoods of them. The Boeing engineers and machinists loading the moving vans and driving away. To California, to the aerospace jobs in the South and the East, anywhere at all that there was work, with a last look in the mirror at the green, rainy town they'd loved, and the mountain they might never see again. The stores downtown went quiet. The whole proud city seemed to hold its breath and grieve. It had reached so high, so joyfully at that fair, and now it was learning the oldest and hardest lesson there is, that reaching high is the very thing that sets you up to fall, and that no boom and no bright decade and no shining tower lasts forever, however sure you were standing at the top of it. Turn out the lights. In the city that had lit up the future at its fair not 10 years before. That's how fast it can go, you see. That's the thing none of us ever knows while we're standing in the good, bright days, that they are numbered, every one, and that the shining tower and the roaring optimism and the whole sure sense that the best is yet to come can turn, in a few short years, into a billboard telling the last one out to cut the lights. The town came back in time, it always does, and that one came back stronger than anybody dreamed. But that's another story for another day. On this day, in this spring, in this decade, all we can do is stand in that last bright, hopeful light and love it for what it was, and know what they could not, that it wouldn't last. It never lasts. That's why you have to love it while it's here. Not to wait for the good days to be behind you before you understand that that's just what they were. To catch the light while it's on the water, and the mountain while it's out, and the people while they're still around your table. That was the whole hard lesson of that rainy town, though it took a bus to teach it. So let the evening come down now over Seattle, this one last time. Let the gray, soft rain come drifting back in off the sound and settle over the green town and the still water. Let the lights come on down the hills and lay their long, wavering colors out across the dark bay. Let the last ferry of the evening pull away from the pier with that low, mournful, beautiful blast of its horn and slide out into the dark toward the islands, its windows warm and gold, growing smaller until it's only a scatter of lights far out on the black water, and then the sound of the horn, one last time, rolling back across the sound. And somewhere out there in the dark, the great mountain stands, hidden now in the cloud and the night, but there, always there, watching over the rainy town and all its hurrying, hopeful people, its fishermen and its Boeing men, its fair and its future and its sorrow, patient as the sea, and older than all of it, and enduring. I hope you had a place like that once, a green and rainy place at the edge of something, with the water always at the foot of the street, and a great mountain out on clear days, and a rare and precious sun that you learned, because you waited so long for it, truly to love. Maybe it was Seattle itself, and you were there, and you rode the monorail as a child, and stood in the crowd at the fair, and can still hear that ferry horn out on the Sound. Or maybe it was some other town at the far edge of the map that the rest of the country overlooked, that you knew was the most beautiful place on earth, even if nobody else could see it. Tell me about it, down below, wherever you are tonight. Tell me about your mountain and your water, and the day the whole town looked up. Leave it there for the rest of us to find, because these things are worth remembering out loud, and worth remembering together, and the more of us who say them, the longer they last. Stay with us, and we'll keep walking the old country home, one rainy spring at a time. I'm Henry. I miss those days. The sweet old America.